The world economy is tethered to a narrow strip of water just 21 miles wide at its narrowest choke point, and someone just severed the line. For decades, the global financial architecture operated under the absolute assumption that the Strait of Hormuz would remain open. That certainty no longer exists. Following an intense cycle of military escalation, including targeted airstrikes and a direct American naval blockade of Iranian ports, the Iranian state has officially shut down the strait for a second time. This single geographic bottleneck dictates the price of energy from Tokyo to Munich. When it closes, the mechanics of modern globalization begin to fracture. The immediate stakes involve 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas and 25% of its seaborne oil trade, which are now completely trapped. The winners are oil-exporting nations outside the Persian Gulf and financial speculators holding energy futures. The losers are everyday consumers facing systemic inflation and manufacturing economies dependent on predictable fuel inputs. This leaves the global economy confronting an existential reality. Can a modern industrial society survive when its primary energy artery is turned into a geopolitical off-switch? To understand how a single body of water wields this much power, it is necessary to examine the physical constraints of the global energy apparatus. Global supply chains rely heavily on maritime transit, because moving immense volumes of raw commodities across oceans remains the cheapest method of transport. The Persian Gulf functions as a giant cul-de-sac for global energy. Major producers like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar pump millions of barrels of oil and millions of cubic meters of gas daily, but nearly all of it has only one viable maritime exit. The Strait of Hormuz is the door to that cul-de-sac. It is not an open ocean, it is a highly restricted marine highway where ships must navigate through narrow, designated inbound and outbound shipping lanes. This rigid physical network exists because building cross-continental pipelines is immensely expensive, geopolitically complex, and structurally insufficient to handle the total volume. This geographic concentration means that localized political volatility automatically transforms into a macro-critical risk for the entire planet. This systemic vulnerability is the direct result of a long-standing security architecture designed in the late 20th century. Following the energy crises of the 1970s, the United States established a foundational geopolitical doctrine. The Persian Gulf was a region of vital national interest, and any attempt by an outside power to gain control of it would be repelled by military force. This framework effectively outsourced the security of the world's primary energy supply to the United States Navy. For decades, export-led economies in Asia and industrial powers in Europe expanded under the umbrella of this American-guaranteed freedom of navigation. Iran, occupying the entire northern coastline of the strait, recognized this dynamic as a fundamental threat to its regional posture. Lacking the conventional naval capacity to match Western fleets, Tehran spent decades investing in asymmetric warfare infrastructure. The strategic incentive for Iran was never to win a conventional naval war, but rather to develop the capability to inflict unacceptable economic pain on the global financial system as a tool of deterrence. The mechanism of this closure is not a traditional wall of warships blocking transit. Instead, it relies on a sophisticated mix of asymmetric military tools and legal leverage. Iran enforces its control using mobile anti-ship missile batteries hidden along its mountainous coastline, fleets of small fast attack craft, low-cost loitering munitions, and sea mines. When the Iranian government declares the strait closed, they do not need to sink every vessel. They only need to target one or two commercial tankers to alter the economic reality of maritime trade. The real enforcement mechanism is dictated by maritime insurance markets in London. Once a waterway is designated a high-risk zone and active attacks occur, underwriters withdraw war risk coverage. Without insurance, commercial ship owners legally cannot and commercially will not permit their multi-million-dollar vessels to enter the Gulf. The system is further complicated by recent Iranian legislative efforts to impose sovereignty tolls on passing vessels, attempting to transform an international strait governed by transit passage rights into territorial waters. This structural shift creates an invisible economic barrier that is just as effective as a physical blockade. The consequences of this disruption cascade through the global economy in distinct phases. In the immediate term, landlocked storage facilities in the Gulf fill up within days, forcing oil wells to shut down production because the crude has nowhere to go. Governments in import-dependent nations face immediate fiscal strain as energy prices spike, forcing central banks to keep interest rates elevated to combat energy-driven inflation. For major corporations, logistics costs climb dramatically as they look for alternative, longer transit routes or face direct supply shortages. The ordinary citizen bears the ultimate cost through higher fuel prices at the pump and increased utility bills, which diminishes household purchasing power. While alternative overland pipelines through Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates exist, their total capacity can only handle a small fraction of the lost volume. The long-term consequence is a massive, permanent capital reallocation as industrial economies accelerate their transition away from Middle Eastern hydrocarbons to insulate themselves from future supply shocks. A widespread misunderstanding concerning this crisis is the belief that a confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz is strictly a localized conflict between Washington and Tehran. The reality is that the United States is virtually energy independent due to domestic shale production and imports from Canada. The primary economic casualties of a prolonged closure are actually located thousands of miles away in Asia. Nations like China, Japan, India, and South Korea rely on the Persian Gulf for the vast majority of their crude imports. A prolonged shutdown directly threatens Chinese industrial output and East Asian economic stability. This misalignment explains why the geopolitical response is shifting. Even as the United States deploys its navy to secure shipping lanes, China is forced to abandon its traditional non-interventionist stance to protect its economic lifelines. The crisis is not a bilateral security dispute, but a systemic shock that directly threatens the industrial foundation of the world's largest manufacturing hubs. As the international community confronts this closure, the trajectory of the global economy depends on three realistic scenarios. The first scenario involves a coordinated multinational naval intervention. Under this outcome, a coalition of Western and Asian powers attempts to establish heavily armed maritime corridors, using continuous aerial surveillance and naval escorts to neutralize drone and mine threats. This requires the complete suppression of Iranian coastal defense systems, risking an open-ended regional war. The second scenario is a diplomatic settlement where international sanctions or naval blockades on Iran are partially lifted in exchange for restoring unhindered commercial transit. This outcome depends entirely on both sides accepting a fragile status quo and recognizing that the economic cost of total escalation is too high to sustain. The third scenario is a prolonged, low-intensity stalemate, where the strait remains functionally closed to Western-aligned shipping, while a shadow fleet of uninsured tankers continues to move limited volumes to specific buyers willing to absorb the extreme risk. The current empty shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz demonstrate the profound fragility of the modern global system. For half a century, the global economy flourished by treating geography as a problem that had already been solved by international law and naval supremacy. The realization that a single nation can abruptly disconnect a quarter of the world's seaborne energy supply reveals that globalization is not an irreversible historical shift, but a vulnerable physical network. The ultimate question is no longer when the shipping lanes will reopen, but whether the international community can ever return to a system that relies so completely on a single, fragile point of failure.